Randy's a primary care physician practicing in the Boston area. He's a published author, having written the book Overturning Zika, which brings to light the highly speculative, highly doubtful underpinnings of that pandemic. Randy has also applied such thinking to the COVID-19 pandemic, and early on he wrote on the absurdity of the high levels of COVID testing in areas or at times where there were few symptoms. Randy hosts a weekly coronavirus conversation videocast at his Viral Conversation page on Facebook and blogs at randybock.com. Today he's going to be speaking about methadone maintenance ignited America's opioid crisis.
Well, thank you so much, Bock. And
Sure.
I'm very happy to see everybody here and all the people out in the Twitter world and YouTube and so forth. By way of introduction, I had a long career in primary care. I ran my own office in kind of a blue collar suburb of Boston, and seeing all kinds of anything, blood pressure, diabetes, broken bones, car accidents, blah blah blah. And then in the mid 2000s, the United States passed a thing called DATA, D-A-T-A, which is I think the Drug Addiction Treatment Act, and the idea was to basically destigmatize narcotic treatment by way of getting people away from methadone clinics, which had become, possibly contrary to the mission of getting people off drugs. And this methadone is kind of a dopey version of heroin. It's got a slow acting, but it's still kind of got the same dopey effects. And when I say dopey, I mean narcotizing, slows you down, and makes you think slower. Has the same euphoria. And if there was a switch made to buprenorphine, which is actually called Suboxone. There was a combo thing. It's naloxone and buprenorphine, and buprenorphine rhymes with morphine. And as a congener, it's another opioid. Opiates, just for kind of like our glossary, opiate is something that's directly from opium, and opioid is a synthetic opiate. So that as far as functionality, they all pretty much are in the same boat. They work on what is kind of like cross eponymously called the endorphin system, which is kind of a backwards formulation because it's the other way around. We have our pleasure axis in our brain, where we are guided by external hands to doing the right behavior. So mere selfishness would have us kind of hoard our own food and keep everything for ourselves. But we wind up wanting to have sex because there's orgasms, and then we have kids, and then we have to share, and we get pleasure from nice glances and nice words and so forth. So our pleasure system is oriented towards better behavior, and our reward is the bliss from this kind of endorphin axis. And the plants only come to mimic that. I mean, they evolved with us, presumably, and they want to be eaten and have their seeds spread. And so poppy seeds, as you probably well know, are tiny, tiny things. If you ever had a bagel or something like that, or certain other desserts. And the poppy plant is a passive thing. All plants are sitting there, and they want their seeds spread, and they can't do it themselves. So they need animals to do that for them. So certain plants will have certain properties, and so we eat it, and then we're going to spread the seed elsewhere. So it's really the other way around. That it's not so much we are mimicking the morphine, because endorphin is really coming from the word morphine. They are endogenous morphine, but the plants are actually mimicked us. What gave us pleasure, and again, it's all long-term biological evolutionary kind of thing. I don't want to get too far into that. Anyway, so you have these pleasure molecules, and humans are very crafty beings, and over time we figure out how to game almost anything. And so you can kind of do the right thing or the wrong thing, and people get into drug issues just as the same way they get into issues of other wanting excess pleasure. It's kind of the difference between liberty and libertine, as Michael Knowles formulates it. They both have the same word in freedom, but if you're libertine, you wind up not having the liberty because you become beholden to the thing which you found so much joy and pleasure in. And so, just an example, I mean, sex is wonderful. I assume that's how most of us got here. But, you don't want to do it on the street. You don't want to do it too many times a day. You don't want to do it with the wrong people. You don't want to do it only by yourself, et cetera, et cetera. So you can get that same pleasure a lot of different ways, but behaviorally and socially, there are constructs that kind of help guide you to doing it the right way, and there's success. And back during my narcotic treatment days, so getting back to the introduction, when buprenorphine came out in the mid-2000s, as a formulation to kind of get people away from the methadone clinics and let them go to their primary care doctor and have detox kind of treatment. I became one of those buprenorphine doctors. I took a short course. I got a special little, prefix for my DEA license, and I was allowed to write buprenorphine. And at the time, you could only have 30 patients in your practice at any given moment. So around 2008 or so, I started doing that in full, and my concept was to detox people. It's really not this article. This lecture is not really about me, but I kind of made a decision like Goldilocks, between the hard and the soft bed and the cold and the hot porridge, finding the median. I felt that detox was a little bit too short. The standard, 3 to 5, 7-day, 10-day detoxes had too many rebounds, was too difficult. People, when they withdraw from opiates, it's not really a life-threatening situation, but they do feel miserable. They feel like the flu. They can have diarrhea, vomiting, that kind of stuff. They kind of go through sweats, chills, so forth. So I tried to stretch it out, to maybe, I wound up having to do like 3 to 4 months of detox with like a 1% grade, which is kind of like, reasonable for a truck to go down a hill without careening out of control and so forth. And I didn't like the forever model, which is kind of what methadone was. And along the way, I had some videos of patients, and I tried to have them tell their own story. I have a book, I have in galleys on this topic. My own medical practice kind of ran afoul from narcotic addicts. One of them was angry at me and wrote something that was false, but it kind of derailed my practice. And I had a suspension in 2014. I fought. It took me I thought it was gonna be a couple of days because it was so obvious that it was a wrong, vengeful, spiteful letter. But the board, the word woke didn't exist then. But there was kind of a political ethos that I was a little bit too tough on the drug addicts because I expected them to go to sobriety. The first stipulation in my statement of allegations from the medical board was that I did not believe addiction was a disease. And this is a crucial point to my article, because the disease model is really a sea change in the way addiction was treated. So there are other models, and these are just models, like there are climate models and so forth. People have modeling, and those aren't necessarily scientific facts. And so I didn't really know those terms at the time. I knew the disease model, but apparently the slightly contrary one is the adaptive model of addiction. We'll get to that as we do the talk. But this is in part and parcel, and use a medical word, kind of endemic of the situation, that if you don't buy into, we saw this with COVID, if you don't buy into the narrative, you are expendable. And not only expendable, but you're to be expunged, expelled, and expiated, and excommunicated, and you are an ex-doctor at the time. So it's a situation that kind of, there's a little bit of soul and maybe animus as well in my lecture here. I hope I avoid some of that. But that's kind of some of the thrust here. I put a lot of my addiction work on hold, my addiction book and so forth, because of the suspension, and I didn't feel I was useful to have the book out when it looked like I was the culprit or somehow doing the wrong thing. But I was pretty much completely absolved. It was again a long trial, but Galileo and other people have had their ideas put out in the public square, and they don't always come out ahead. So I feel grateful to be alive and be able to talk about this. But my medical practice at that time, my own practice, that disappeared, and I'm doing other things right now. And one of them is writing, and so one of them is to talk about this topic. Anyway, without further ado, I'm going to see if I can go to my magic slideshow here, and let's see how we do. Deaths of despair. And I've got to see if I can just kind of minimize this a little bit, move it over. There we go. So The boom times, we had kind of the longest kind of continuous period of prosperity. I call it the long boom. Maybe it's a bit catchier phrase for this, but from kind of the Reagan era to Bush 1, Clinton, Bush 2, and so forth, was kind of the longest continuous time of increasing GDP, and prosperity, with skirmishes, but really very little in the way of war on the level of Vietnam, Korea, World War II, et cetera. And to an extent that continues today, but there have been further, there's been kind of an erosion in the economic sphere. So I don't want to really talk about that too much. But deaths of despair, pretty much, if you see over here in this part of the graph, they were at an even, but the suicide was going down. The thing that was going up is drugs deaths. And so during this time of prosperity, things got worse on the opioid. The drug deaths are pretty much almost exclusively opiate deaths. When things are really bad, alcohol tends to creep up, with people kind of killing themselves with alcohol. But here we have kind of an inimical proposition that deaths of despair kind of evened up, but they would have frankly been going down because suicide was going down during this period of prosperity, but opiate deaths went up. So what's up with that? Well, we can see during this period of time, 1980 to 2010, there were fewer drugs being used. These are the good times. And so stimulants, sedatives, inhalants, cocaine, alcohol, tranquilizers, marijuana even, which was becoming more accepted, those uses all went down. Hallucinogens went up a tiny, tiny bit, but the ones that really went up were heroin and opioids. So this is like, for me, this is the same category. This is like, which kind of cheese you have, whether you have brie or cheddar. And we've all heard of the opioid epidemic, and I didn't really stop to poll people, but the times I've done it informally, I ask people what brought on the opioid epidemic, and people are, they'll debate whether it's fentanyl or OxyContin, but pretty much it's between those two. Most people will say, oh, it's big pharma, Purdue. They're familiar with the movie, the series, I guess Netflix, Painkiller, and a bunch of other movies similar about the Sackler family. And I'm not here to expiate them per se, but that's really not the issue. Fentanyl is its own crime in a sense. It's kind of a crime of disintegration. I think China is playing kind of a not only a TikTok, but a social war of sorts. And you can, maybe put coronavirus the way it was kind of mischaracterized and kind of given the Hollywood type of treatment of people dropping dead in the streets and hazmat suits and all that kind of stuff. I think that was a misappropriation of the situation. And I think, I think there's been China's sort of wants to sell to us, but they're also our social, cultural, kind of Cold War foe. And fentanyl is pretty much exclusively produced in China, and it's shipped over to Mexico either in parts or nearly intact. And they have their own network. They kind of are dealing with the cartels and whatnot. And it's a very external thing. They don't really have fentanyl in China. And so it's allowed. Nothing gets made in China without kind of government knowledge. And so the extent of fentanyl here, they could turn it off if they wanted to tomorrow. They don't, they won't, and they could. But again, so if you go to this from the CDC, so if you look at their interpretation of the opioid epidemic, there's three waves: OxyContin, pure heroin at lower prices, and fentanyl. That's that. And I think this has recency bias. And I'm getting old enough to shed some of that. I put this exact same picture. You can see it here. I shrunk it a little bit. I squeezed it somewhat. You can see it here on the right. There's three waves of opioid overdose death. That's according to the CDC. But if you look at the big picture, you go back even to the old times of 1960, there was pretty much zero opioid usage in the country. When I say zero, there are about 35,000 addicts estimated from the methods at hand at the time, extrapolated across the country. Right now, there's 100 times that. There's 3 million, 6 million opioid users. The number is not precise. They don't all come in for registry. But there's a first wave of opioid increase. This is the U.S. Drug overdose deaths. And again, these are almost exclusively opioid overdose. There really are very few overdoses from anything else. So this is pretty much opioids. And what you're seeing here is something that nobody talks about for the opioid epidemic. So this is the essence of my proposition, that this first wave came about, and what was it? What was up with that? This is a quote from 100 years ago, where cocaine was so I can maybe go forward one point here. First, there were a fair number of opioid addicts and heroin addicts in 100 years ago. This dropped pretty much to zero, as I mentioned, and then it increased drastically. Now, this is a kind of confusing chart because the general population was different. 100 years ago, I think there were maybe 150 million people in the country, and now we have more than double that number. So this is actually by per capita. This is kind of in accord with a big opioid problem. Let's say we make this line up per capita twice as high. So this would be kind of it would almost be like a U-shaped curve. We went from really high opioid usage to zero, back to high opioid usage. That's an interesting phenomenon that's not discussed in the terms of the opioid epidemic. So just to go backwards a little bit. So this quote here talks about cocaine being used to treat morphine addiction. And he's saying at least this was substitution of, he's not grossly in favor, but at least it's a substitution of one different toxin for another. It's a completely different case with heroin, which is merely diacetyl morphine. It doesn't, you're basically, again, I'll bring this up further, but you're kind of treating a whiskey problem with vodka. So here's, and I have this kind of red and green purposefully, like a stop sign, abstinence, sobriety, opprobrium, which is a nice word for, kind of shaming people and so forth. Nobody likes the word shaming, so I put opprobrium, which nobody will know. But on the other side, you have a change in the model. Now models, you can have all these climate models, doesn't really necessarily change the climate. But if you have a model for society and we are the experiment, yes, it can change us. We can see, just on the TikTok example I was mentioning about China, that China societally doesn't get it has a TikTok filter of what they'll show. They don't show the transgender thing. They don't show people piercing and drugging and whatnot. They don't show kind of societal deterioration, and they don't have that. I mean, I'm not saying it's a wonderful, wonderful place, because I think there's not liberty. So if we have a lot of liberty, but again, this verges on libertine. So the model that you have for your society, when we are the experimentation, changes people. So we have destigmatization, we have the disease model, we have replacement narcotic, and we have maintenance. And what we've seen, when this was a literal change in the 1960s, in theory, from above, from the top to the bottom. Charles Murray writes this really well. There's a fabulous book called Coming Apart, where the elites themselves don't live the lives they propose and propound on others. If you go to his examples, he has a mythical town, Belmont. It's modeled on Belmont, Massachusetts, which is a leafy suburb, and the elites live there, the Harvard professors and whatnot. And for their own kids, don't drug, don't drink, don't tattoo, don't do this, don't do that. And they sit and study, and they become degreed academics like their parents. And their theories, their libertine theories, like free needles and needle exchanges and condoms in the school, whatever, kind of like, the harm reduction model, those things play out in his Fish Town, which is modeled on kind of Fish Town suburb, kind of blue collar, kind of like my blue collar suburb of Boston, where lower class wind up doing the policies, living out the policies, and they wind up being more conservative, essentially, politically, And so it's kind of a weird interchange. Anyway, so we see this kind of temporally instead of physically in space. And what we've seen is, again, a huge change in our society based on going from the concept of one to the other. Again, this is to the point of Fosilier earlier, the French MD, that replacing heroin over here for morphine. Morphine, mind you, was sort of a cure, an ostensible cure put out for opium addiction. So people were smoking opium and figuring out other ways to use it, paste and whatnot. And morphine came along, and that was supposed to be the easier way of getting off opium. And then heroin came along to get people off morphine, and then methadone to get people off heroin, and buprenorphine to get people off methadone, and there we go. So this does not happen in other addictions. When Tiger Woods came in with his supposed sex addiction, and he was he was a little kind of like bunny rabbits in the spring. Nobody came in and gave him prescription, for only 3 hookers a week or something like that. This doesn't really happen for cocaine. It doesn't happen for benzos, alcohol. We sober people up. We chat with them. We try to redirect their lives over. We don't give them the hair of the dog. And this is an interesting question, why this happens only in opiates. But there you have it. And I'm going to try to get to why it happened in opiates. It happened for the wrong reasons. A little bit like COVID again. What we have is a situation where the tail wagged the dog. I'm a New Yorker. I was born in the Bronx. I was born in New York City technically, but grew up in the Bronx exclusively and lived there until college. And I was a Yankee fan. I love New York, all things New York, et cetera, et cetera. And New York has had its ups and downs and maybe downs again after some more recent ups. And so I kind of was my, life there a lot was in the 1970s. And it was a rough and tumble place. We see a little bit, that again. People, the prodrome of the 70s were the 60s, and there was an increase in crime. We would kind of see it as minuscule today, because the 50s were halcyon days as far as crime goes and murder and whatnot. But there was an increase, and the increase had to do with narcotics. Recently, I'm friendly with Keith Abloh, who used to be on Fox News, and he's a psychiatrist, MD, not practicing. He has his own issues with the board separately, but he interviewed me on this topic, and he came up with a great formulation. So just to put the issue out there, New York City was having an increase in crime, and it was kind of a black on white thing. It was from the black, pretty much exclusively black neighborhoods of Harlem and Bedford Stuyvesant. That's where the heroin usage was. New York City had pretty much, 25-time higher rate of heroin addiction than any other city in the country, except for Chicago and LA. So if you looked at, New York compared to Omaha, New York compared to Springfield, Illinois, whatever, there was 25 times higher. So we saw everything through a lens of New York City. And New York City had the CBS, ABC, NBC. That's where everything was in the 1960s, before things had moved out to LA. Not even the baseball teams had moved out yet. So it was a very new, as far as intellectually and the press, the word getting out, news and so forth. We see the power of what was legacy media. There was no other media at the time, and New York Times and so forth. And the people doing the TV were reading the New York Times. The New York Times was very pro methadone and pro Rockefeller University doctors Dole and Niswander, who came up with the concept, and Dr. Mary Jane Creek, who came up with the concept of methadone maintenance. But what the problem was crime. So people in Harlem, they were poor. As bad as people think race relations are now, they were probably worse, and they were very different because it was much more segregated, literally. And there wasn't the outreach and the possibility of kind of moving up and so forth. There was, there wasn't kind of these helping hands, whether they've done well or not is a separate story, but there's not affirmative action. There wasn't really the push for assimilation and whatnot. So people had their separate lives, But they weren't that separate, because New York City is a dense place and people can take the train, and they, a couple stops and they can be somewhere else, bicycles and whatnot. So crime was bleeding from Harlem and Bedford Stuyvesant into wealthier neighborhoods in Brooklyn Heights and or Upper East Side, West Side of Manhattan. And so the people who write for and read, and the audience in the New York Times, they were under threat for theft and for crime. And so how did they deal with it? So getting back to Dr. Abloh, he came up with a nice formulation. He said, how they dealt with it was to throw methadone at it. They were addicted to heroin, and they said, you know what? We can't stop them from doing heroin because they are the other, essentially. We can't fix them. We can't talk with them. We can't deal with them. We can't, get them jobs or try to give them job training. We can't figure out how to deal with this problem socially. So we will throw methadone at it. We'll give them the drug that they're hunting for, and they'll stop bothering us. That's kind of the ethos of what it was. So his example was cupcakes. He said, if there was obesity issue and people were getting obese through cupcakes, eating cupcakes, and they couldn't afford these, exotic cupcakes and this and that, so they're stealing for it. What are we going to do? We're just going to give them cupcakes. This is not really dealing at the essence of the root of the problem. So I kind of like that cupcake formulation. So literally, this is in the New York Times, 1969, before methadone had become a big thing. And you can see it. Heroin will be given. Heroin users will be given methadone in a program to curb crime. So this is really the crux of the issue. This is right at the incidence. It was not to fix addiction. It was to curb crime. This is from the graphics are a little old looking here because they are actually old. This is from White, I think 1950. Actually, in the 1960s, he wrote this. This might be from Ball, and actually, this is from Ball and Chambers, who wrote about addiction at the time. In 1936, addicts, and there were far fewer of them, but it was kind of before the Great Reduction in the 40s and whatnot. They were mostly white. That's because that's where people, that was the composition in urban areas. So in 1966, this is, again, it's mostly a New York City problem, Chicago, Los Angeles, and a few other urban areas where heroin was able to filter in from abroad. It was more of a Black problem. And this is from his William L. White's Heroin Addiction in the 1950s. The trend of heroin use in poor African-American, Latino Americans that had begun before World War II continued. It actually was in the same neighborhoods it had always been in, like basically Harlem and Bedford Stuyvesant, but in poor neighborhoods, but who lived in those neighborhoods changed. And William Burroughs, the scion of the Burroughs typewriter fortune, and kind of a dissolute guy, but an interesting writer. And I wrote Naked Lunch, and he was part of the Beat generation, Jack Kerouac, all that kind of stuff, a lot of drugs. And he shot his wife in the head, got away with it, said he was reenacting William Tell. That was enough, I guess, money, I don't know, who knows. But he once noted that basically heroin is a disease of exposure. So, when people call heroin use or opiate addiction a disease, it's different from something that's innate, like diabetes or a cancer or something like that. This happens only if you are exposed to it. So he was pointing out in the 60s, and then later, this is we mentioned this in an Esquire magazine, I think in the early 2000s, that, certain countries don't have heroin addiction. Afghanistan might, Iran does. They don't have alcohol, and other places, were the converse. They had alcohol and they didn't have heroin. So people will have addiction issues, but they don't necessarily have heroin problems or opiate problems per se. You need that stuff to, you kind of need the match to strike, or the flint, whatever. You need them both together. So this is again from an older book, and they actually looked at Lexington. With Lexington Hospital in New York City and Fort Worth, Texas. And so this differs from the U.S. Census in 1960. This is the population mix in the country. And this is mostly, these are non-South and South whites, and then other minorities. But the minorities, Puerto Ricans, not in Fort Worth, but they were in New York City, represented a large fraction of the heroin usage. and blacks, whether from the South or not, and whites were a smaller fraction, certainly much less than their population would dictate. So this is what happened once. Kind of like this. I'm maybe making it a little bit more confusing than it has to be, but basically the crime issue that brought about methadone was right in the 1960s. My screen's a little bit obscured, so I can't see the dates per se. Whoops, sorry about that. But basically, through the era of opprobrium and abstinence and so forth, there were very little crime. This is 1 murder a day level. And once methadone became unleashed, oh, here's 1965. Okay, I'm sorry, I have the dates on the top. That makes it easier. Once 1965 came along, this is what brought about methadone. Okay, this increase in crime over here in New York City, this annual homicides in New York City. So they had an increase here right before Prohibition, kind of the mobster era, and then it went down through the 50s, the 40s, and 50s, and then 1960s started to creep up. So this is what they're reacting to. So rather than take the same, they had the same exact problem over here, and they put on Prohibition, not they, but the country did, and then it went down. So they did exactly the opposite tack. In 1965, they did basically unprohibition. They gave people exactly that to which they were addicted, and guess what happened? This happened. So crime skyrocketed. So it's just an incredible change from New York City, all the previous centuries, decades, and whatnot. But even you just look at the modern era here, here's where they were, around 1 murder a day, and they basically rose that 3-4 times higher. And then change in the paradigm. This is the Giuliani era. Stop and frisk is up here. When Giuliani came in, everything just went down again. This is humans are, we are the experiment. We react to the experimental conditions, and this is an issue. This is exactly what I'm talking about. The permissiveness, whether you like it or not, brought about more crime, more drugs, more opiate deaths. So one of Giuliani, one of his orders was to, basically get rid of methadone. He was not successful. He had a lot of pushback. You can see, again, from COVID, anybody who stands out like this, if you didn't want to do masking, basically you kind of get spit out. He didn't get spit out, but all his policies, there was embedded bureaucracy that did not let this happen. And so did methadone actually stop the crime? So the New York City Crime Index, no, it did not, basically. Short answer. Through the 1670s, we saw from the previous chart with homicide, but it did not stop crime in general. And so again, they were dealing with this little blip over here. And if they looked at it historically, contextually, they would not have seen, that this is the right path. But after the Gun Institute, I guess again, I have my camera in front of this. It's a little bit difficult for me to see. But so here, the 60s, they had kind of a weathering. 1970s when methadone really came into existence and started taking off, and the greater use of methadone increased or coincided with the increase of crime. I'm not saying it's cause and effect. So there were people against this. In 1970, Robert Baird of Harlem's Haven helped addicts voluntarily end narcotics. Saw that methadone was really no different. There was no major benefit. It's kind of like channeling Paul Solier from that first slide from 100 years prior, well, from 70 years, 60, 70 years prior, where basically you're giving people a narcotic, and it's, they're going to be addicted to that, and it's nothing new for them. The kids in 1945 used to call them dollies. It's for Dolafin, which is the alternate medical name for methadone. It's the same thing, methadone, Dolafin. And so basically, again, you're kind of throwing vodka at a whiskey problem. Getting back to Giuliani, I probably never leave him, but crime in New York, vastly dropped, and it went underneath the national. Here's New York City in red, so it went underneath the national crime rate under Giuliani tenure in office. So methadone didn't fix Harlem; it spread the despair. And so here's a quote on capitalism from Winston Churchill: "The inherent vice of capitalism is the unequal sharing of blessing. the inherent virtue of socialism is the equal sharing of miseries. So this actually applies not so much for capitalism here, but for heroin. Heroin usage was pretty much an inner city, poor neighborhood problem. And again, it's not really a black problem because there was in white neighborhoods that had the same heroin problem in the 1930s and so forth. But those neighborhoods happen to be black in Puerto Rico and New York City, and similar in Chicago. But Mexican and black in Fort Worth. And it wasn't the color of your skin or your ethnicity; it's the poverty, the misery. And we'll speak to this when we talk about the adaptive model of addiction, which is that people adapt to their circumstance. They're really miserable. They try to find some escape. And he's the inventor of Rat Park, if you ever heard of that experiment. The rats with nice circumstances, have the opportunity to tap for drugs, and they don't. And the rats in miserable, kind of the cinder block, rat mazes with nothing there, no stimulation. They do the drugs all the day. So this is a tricky chart, but I want people to take a sense of it because I find this one amazing. This is from JAMA Psychiatry, and I can't read the year, but it's obviously after the 2010s. So this talks about non-white versus white, and the non-white in this case, pretty much black, usage of opioid addiction by race. So, mind you, in 1960, the total U.S. population was 89% white. 1960s non-white rate was 7 times the white. So this is the total sample percentage of people using heroin, and whites and non-whites pretty much were the same. Non-whites are slightly fewer, but what's missing here is the fraction. The rate of non-whites usage was 7 times higher because they should really have been down here at 11%, and white should be at 89% with equal use amongst everybody. So this is what happens over time. So we get to a spread. This is speaking to Churchill's point. So the inherent vice of early heroin usage was the unequal sharing of blessings, well, if you want to call them blessings or whatever, and the misery of the virtue of socialism is the equal sharing of miseries. So what we did was basically we didn't get the heroin use rate of non-whites to improve. It only winds up being exactly proportional to population rate, and ditto for the whites. So basically, the black problem generalized out to the white population. So this may look, well, now it's great. We have equality, so forth. But again, it's really almost specifically spot on with Churchill's quote when you change out the words for heroin. So this is a little busy slide. I'm not going to really spend time on it. But from on top, again, a little bit like COVID, there were federal rules and regulations that happened that changed things. And Nixon, he went along with this. And in 1971, the FDA changed the classification because a lot of people wanted to keep people on methadone, and they wanted to treat women pregnant and whatnot. They changed the classification and basically made it a little bit like, again, you want to analogize a little bit like, EUA for vaccines. They took away some of the prohibitions and they had more of it. So they loosened the policy under the guise of accessibility because ostensibly, addiction is a disease that needs ongoing treatment. This is, again, the disease model. The disease model changed everything, and they made this into a medical treatment like insulin for diabetes. And before that, it had been seen as people having an addiction. They need to get off and they need to be treated to sobriety. And this basically, these rules change it to being just treated for treatment. You don't ever want to sober anybody up off of insulin. If they're type 1 diabetic, you can't sober them to non-diabetes by taking away their insulin. That doesn't work. You kill them. And so this is analogized oftentimes in the 1970s by physicians in the methadone world to opiate treatment, diabetes and opiate addiction. They see it as very similar situations. As a result, the number of methadone quote unquote clients rose, and numbers were hard for me to find. I'm sure a deeper researcher could find. I found some data points, and some of these are extrapolated. So this is pretty much what it is. I can't speak to the parts with fewer dots. This is despite methadone itself being a killer. It's an opiate, and like I showed you chemically, it's almost the same stuff. The comparison I use, if you have a cup of coffee and you want to sweeten it. You put sugar in it, it sweetens right away. You can drink it. If you put molasses in it, you drink it right away. It's not going to be sweet. You have to wait and stir and get the whole molasses, integrated into the coffee, and then it will be sweet. The only difference in sweetness, I mean, if you have honey or molasses in your tea or coffee, it's going to be just as sweet as sugar. The difference is that sugar sweetens it fast. And so heroin is basically basically heroin's sugar, and methadone is molasses. It's the same sweetness, same high. It's just methadone takes a little bit longer to kick in. And so you get just as dead from an overdose from methadone as opiate. You have to use it a little bit differently. And, I'm not going to, talk about junkie skills and whatnot. Clearly, people are having issues with fentanyl. They take some time to equilibrate to the medication and so forth. But people are dying from methadone. Mind you, not just the people, in treatment, but the people in treatment would figure out ways to sneak out the methadone, and it wound up being sold, externally. This is part of the spread from the graph here. Part of the reason that the non-white problem extrapolated to the whites is the markets changed. People sold the methadone and they got addicted to that, and then needed heroin to replace that, and so forth. So speaking to this underlying change in ethos, paradigms, and whatnot, we see here two engrams, which are book frequency word searches and comparisons. And before there was the term harm reduction, which is kind of the word used, I think, for me, I see it more frequently than medicalization, but so be it here. Medicalization started coincident with this push towards methadone. Really, it was incipient in 1965, but it really didn't catch on until 1970s. Again, like most people, when they think of the 1960s as hippies and whatnot, most of that was 1970s. It's almost the same thing here. The theories happened in the 60s. The action happened in the 70s. And so medicalization grew as a term, and then shortly followed by harm reduction. We'll get to that a little bit later. But you can see here that the term methadone grew, and pretty much coincident with heroin. Heroin, before methadone was a term, people didn't talk about or write about heroin that much because there wasn't that much heroin around. And there's some lag time with writing books. So maybe like a 5-year backwards window. And then the opioid overdoses started to grow and this is, again, just words being used, but I see this as a general societal reflection of these things here. So medicalization brought on methadone, methadone brought on heroin, heroin brought on opioid deaths, as did methadone itself. Now, other drugs, we talked about this with the disease of despair early on. The alcohol deaths decreased. Alcohol consumption actually slightly increased. This is 1960 and 1980. This is before the long boom. So this is more kind of, the Vietnam War era and the 70s, some of its recession, depression, Nixonian era, slowdowns and whatnot. Anyway, gas lines, Jimmy Carter, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, but opioid usage skyrocketed. There was a mild increase in alcohol consumption, but it was not actually the number of alcohol users. Basically, the people drinking alcohol used a little bit more. There's about a 50% raise in the amount of people drinking per episode of drinking, because maybe prices and whatnot, people are wealthier. But it was not a gross number per capita in alcoholics. There was a gross increase in what I'll call narcoholics during the same period. Vastly greater numbers, going from about 100,000 to 700,000 narcotic addicts nationwide. That's a 7-fold increase, pretty much compared to was nothing increase in alcohol usage aside from per drinks. This is just a picture from an article on methadone mile in Boston, near methadone clinics. This is the lives we have created. This is a life. But there's a whole, I'm sure people have seen people who are hanging around methadone clinics. Nobody wants one in the neighborhood for a reason. There's just a lot of people they're so doped up for so long, and they're just kind of lying there I mean, it looks like agony, but they're sort of blissful on the inside. They're just externally, they're not helping themselves. It's kind of like, again, the short circuiting of the pleasure ability I mentioned earlier on, that we are crafty animals, but sometimes not to our own benefit. So what about this? I mean, what did the I'm going to maybe take a little segue here, or break. But what happened? You know, we basically, you know, at a certain point, there was something called government cheese. I don't know if anyone ever saw it, but government cheese was brought to neighborhoods where there was poverty, and the idea was huge blocks of American cheese, unsliced, and people would have that. And I don't really know what the market surrounding that was, but I assume that places where government cheese got shipped off, that people didn't eat these huge blocks of cheese. They cut it up, they sold it. You can see what's happening with Hamas when the food shipments come. You know, that doesn't necessarily get distributed to the people. It winds up going to those in charge, and they have a network. You can call it a military, a cabal, gangs, whatever you want to call it, and they distribute it to themselves and for their own methods, and they wind up, you know, dealing with it how they will and selling it and so forth. They wind up, you know, redounds to their own benefit. And so to this point, when we invented methadone as a free narcotic to be handed out, we poured a lot of opiate into the system. Now, if we'd done this with, again, vodka, if we all of a sudden had a free vodka system, bartenders would not necessarily have gone out of business. They would have had to change their prices. If every time they release the government reserve of you know, petroleum or whatever, the gas prices go down temporarily. You'll probably see it during this election cycle. We have you know, petroleum reserves, and everybody nervous about the election, they somehow find an emergency, release the petroleum reserves, and the prices, you know, stay stable or decrease. And everyone's like, oh my God, things are great at the pump. They're doing their summer driving and so forth. So markets react. And so the creation of government cheese, of free heroin via methadone, free opiate, basically influenced the marketplace. The drug dealers didn't become real estate agents. They didn't suddenly say, oh my God, what am I going to do? I've been selling heroin. What am I going to do now? You know what, I'll become, you know, an accountant. You know, I'll do this. I mean, their lives were geared. They have networks. They have connections. They might have a habit themselves. They're going to be. They're still going to be dealt the heroin to themselves, and they're going to find a place for it. You can think of Tony Soprano or whatever. They're not going to be convinced to leave crime just because things got tougher. They're going to change their market, and they're going to do things a little bit differently. So. This is effectively what happened. The dealers wound up changing zones, and they changed age. So here, you know, heroin use is skyrocketing amongst middle-class suburban teens, and the mean age of heroin usage went down. So these dealers adapted. Not only that, but everybody along the distribution network, they're still working on efficiencies, shipping, you know, cultivating, whatnot. Everything got better with better technology, better shipping routes, and so forth. Airfares, you know, everything economically improved during this period. And why not heroin? And so we see this actually in heroin retail prices, 1990 to 2006. The number of methadone clients from that previous graph you saw is kind of it's layered on top here. Basically, the number of methadone, I'm not saying, I can't say this is cause and effect, but these two things happen simultaneously. As we keep adding more methadone, we keep adding more methadone to the brew, heroin prices go down. I personally don't think this is a coincidence. I think this is heroin having to work harder to make the sale and getting people on the stuff, and then they work by volume. And this is a very busy chart. So I'll try to explain it. There's a thing in this harm reduction world called, I touch the thing, it goes, called the opioid gap. And they see this, the treatment world, and pretty much the treatment world has its own marketplace where they make money keeping people on replacement opioids. They see the gap that they need more treatment so that that they will, I guess, help everybody who is in search of opiates find their opiate. Again, we don't do this for alcohol. We don't help people in search of whiskey find vodka. We don't do it for people who are looking for cocaine. We don't do it for hallucinogens. We don't do it for other drugs. We don't give them the drug, except with this. And we don't, and not, mind you, not every country does either. But we've decided to do this. And so here's the methadone census. On this graph, the previous one looked pretty high. and it's still going up, but this is from the 2000s, where it's a little bit leveled off because we added buprenorphine to the mix. And so what do I write here? Adding buprenorphine to the narcotic replacement treatment mix only marginally diminished the, untreated, what they call the untreated gap, but did bring about a greater number of opioid users. So we've added buprenorphine to the mix, and the user capacity increased here. And so the total number of treated addicts goes here. So the gap has decreased a little bit, but the usage overall keeps outpacing this treatment. So we are it's a dog chasing his tail. The more replacement drug we get, the more people we get addicted to the drug theoretically we are replacing, because we've given the taste of it and we don't detox people. Anytime somebody misses a dose at buprenorphine clinic or methadone clinic, they go traveling, or they lose their dose, or somebody gets stolen, or they sell it, whatever, they go out on the market and they find some. So the market coexists with the treatment market. And the more we increase the treatment market, the more we increase the general market. Again, the dealers, the drug dealers, heroin dealers, the criminal element, that, if it's organized crime, they're still organized, they're still criminals. And this doesn't really change. And so this is along the same concept about the marketplace. The price per high, this is a European numbers, but basically same here because we have the same sourcing. Purity has increased of heroin. The price kind of modulates, but basically the price per high, because the purity increase has mostly gone down throughout the 2010s. This is this is again a busy slide, but I'll try to explain it. Again, getting back to ethos and type of behaviors we promote, what methadone does is it's kind of a lethargy drug, and people who are on methadone stay on methadone for years. It's possibly a lifetime treatment, again, like the diabetic disease model, and it slows them down, and it's hard for people on methadone to get a separate job. Buprenorphine is not that way. Buprenorphine is not as dopey. It is dopey. I wouldn't give it to a kid. Give it if you anybody here not addicted to opiates took a buprenorphine pill, a single one, you'd probably be asleep the rest of the day. It is a dopey pill. It's not as dopey. It's not as dopey as heroin. It's not as dopey as methadone. But because of the lethargy part of methadone, people a lot of times, once they're on treatment, that's it. They somewhat disable themselves, and they can't really do functional stuff while they're on the treatment. So the reason there's a methadone mile and nobody wants to live near a methadone clinic, because people are just kind of lying passed out on the street, as if the zombie apocalypse has hit and they were the first victims. So this coincides with an increase in general disability. So I'm not saying this is cause and effect, but the number of people disabled coincides, again, change in ethos. We're kind of handing out disability more easily. We have this kind of sympathy mode. We care about the victims and so forth. We don't expect them to change. We consider that people have diseases for things like obesity, gambling, a lot of cultural adaptive things which are not necessarily positive adaptations. We don't think people can get rid of them. We call them brain changes and whatnot. The previous era would not necessarily put up with this stuff, and as a result, we have higher numbers of SSDI. This is permanent, quasi-permanent Medicare level disabled workers, and this taps into the Social Security fund. I'm not going to go into Al Gore's lockbox and whatnot, but it's not locked. It's not a box, and the numbers increased. You pay for it one way or another. So let's move on here. We could probably skip over this. This is buprenorphine has gone up, and as it's gone up, the dose per day has also gone up. So if this is a disease, somehow, if you look at the gross level per day per capita of insulin by diabetics, it doesn't really change so much. So it's kind of a standard use. The standard level of treatment for penicillin, or antibiotic for pneumonia doesn't really change so much. The dosing levels don't change so much, except with opiates, and it keeps going up. It only goes in one direction. And this increase in treatment has gone up with overdose death rate. This is not just the absolute numbers we've looked at before. This is the death rate, and it precedes fentanyl. And it did go up in the 70s. I guess it tapered here through the 80s, but then it started increasing with the greater number of methadone users, and kind of bleeding back towards heroin users and whatnot. So what is the disease model? Well, this kind of came out of thin air a little bit. Rockefeller University, it's in New York City, East Side. And this is a married couple, Vincent Dole and Marie Niswander, along with Mary Jean Creek. And their vision became known as the metabolic theory. And they don't really have an answer to it, but they're basically making a disease as metabolic imbalance by traumatic development, environmental experiences, some combination of factors, blah, 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 metabolic. They don't know which the metabolic thing is. They don't know what the metabolism is, but basically you're on drugs and things are bad for you. I don't argue this point that things are bad for you. And you do have something like an illness when you withdraw from it. But this is not any different from, grief. If you're married 30 years and God forbid your spouse dies, you're going to be miserable. You'll probably be throwing up, feeling horrible. We have, when we, when getting back to our friend Tiger Woods, when he was found out by his wife and he hit by the golf club, and he was exposed and he was shamed, his golf game disappeared. He couldn't win anything for years. And his whole career arc changed, and it's misery. I don't think misery doesn't exist. I just don't think misery happens to be a disease. He has learned, I think, to a certain extent from his problem. And if you have, the only good part about misery is you learn stuff and you try to avoid the factors that brought you that. And what we've done here is we've kind of taken away the learning ability for people. So here's to the point about diabetes. These are physicians in the 1970s. It's a parallel to former addicts. Medical dependence on methadone is they call him a former addict. Now, I'm a word guy kind of guy. I'm very particular. This is a current addict. He just doesn't. He's formerly addicted to heroin. He's currently addicted to methadone. So the former addicts medical. All these are begging the question. The term, partitio principi, where you are putting words into evidence that are not really foundational, not really proven. So the former addicts' medical dependence on methadone is a parallel to the type 1 diabetic's dependence on insulin. See, the disease is not cured, but brought under medical control. I find this hugely shoddy thinking. This is a multi-physician, so it took many physicians to come up with this little canard here, but I disagree with it. Methadone can't give you a job, can't make you literate, but for healing the medical symptoms of heroin addiction, methadone equates with what insulin is for diabetics. Now, this is a little bit milder. He's saying they can heal the medical symptoms, not of heroin addiction, frankly, of heroin withdrawal. So he's wrong also. And it should be a temporary thing. And again, my Goldilocks approach was to give people 3 months, 4 months or so with sobriety from every other drug, and ultimately sobriety from buprenorphine itself. But I wasn't following the disease model, so boom, there you go. Here's not diabetes. Okay, if this were insulin dosage by state, you would see pretty much a uniform line, according to if you factored in weight and whatnot, and age and whatnot. So if you basically age and weight normalize this, you would see the single insulin dose for every diabetic, type 1 diabetic around the country. Here we have methadone dose by state. Rhode Island, 157 milligrams per day. And for some reason, if you're Kansas, you only get 20. Are the Kansas heroin addicts that different? Florida, okay? I mean, a lot of people from Rhode Island wind up in Florida. Florida is like the, I don't know, second most populous state in the country right now, third, somewhere in there. So what's going on here? Are their addicts so different? I mean, their population is hugely diverse. Probably no more or less than Delaware, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Maryland, Massachusetts, and yet their dose is a sixth of Rhode Island's. And I don't know. You tell me why Missouri, South Dakota, Mississippi. I mean, I think this has to Texas down here. It's again two of our three most populous states, Texas, Florida, and even California, have methadone doses that are a fraction of the Northeast. Do we have like dopier, diabetics? I mean, if you want to use the analogy, it's I just don't understand this. This is your disease model at work. What's the disease? And so Dr. Creek, one of the co-founders of the metabolic theory, basically disease model that predicated the need for methadone treatment of heroin addiction, she lamented that 90% of the world doesn't get methadone maintenance treatment. She's sad about this. 90% of the world. Yet no methadone-free country has magnified its opioid deaths more than the United States in these last 60 years. The closest competitor would be Russia, yet they only have 20% of our opioid fatality rate per person. So heroin was really unknown in the Soviet until Afghanistan war. But they do not see methadone as a replacement. They don't think you're drug-free until you're free from the replacement drugs as well. And this is a doctor who she had a heroin addiction herself. And I'm not going to read these to you, but you can stop the show and look at this later on, or read the article. We have our own similar proponents. This is the late Dr. Mitchell Rosenthal. He had Phoenix House, similar to Dr. Baird above. He was into a sobriety treatment through Phoenix House. And he said, methadone is a very useful drug for a limited number of people. It has been oversold for a wide number of people. Because many addicts abuse multiple drugs and have limited education and job skills, they're not going to be chemically fixed by giving them another drug. Now, he could have said the same opiate. And he mentions here, I like this quote here, and I'll read it. We give them the support they need to share their destructive secrets, to shed their guilt, to purge their rage, and to unlock their potential. And I think this is just a hugely deep quote. It is not easy. Ken, as that guy who treated narcotic addicts for nearly a decade, it's not easy. I think that there's a fair amount of what I'll call underparenting in the world, but in particular through certain populations. You look at prisons, the rate of having prisoners coming from two continually married parents is very, very low. It's much lower in the general population. For men, not having a dad at home is I think a force multiplier of 10 to 15 or 20 times more likely to do violent crime. And men do most of your crime out there. Men probably predominate in narcotic addiction. And there's a lot of angst. There's a lot of stuff going on. There's a lot of fire and brimstone in their lives. And they have issues. They have not put their lives together. If they did, they wouldn't be doing the drugs. And when they do get their lives together, they're much less likely to do the drugs. The adaptive model plays both ways. When people have something at stake, I mean, a lot of my people wound up deciding and having the impetus to get off narcotics when they had something at stake, for better or for worse, good or bad. It could be they're pregnant and they want to have a baby, not come out addicted to the methadone and have to go through withdrawal, the withdrawal they couldn't do in a few days, in months or years. They have the baby do it in a couple of days and whine and have to shake and whatnot. And so they have a positive motivation to get off drugs. Other people, it's like, well, you will lose your job. You will lose your custody if you come up dirty on the drug screen. So whatever the motivation is, or you might go back to prison, you might be on probation. Whatever the motivation is, when people have something honest on their scaffolding where they have to climb a certain way or stay at a certain level, they stay off drugs. So be it. That's life. There's no life without tension. And along the way, they have their grief, they have their issues, they have their struggles. And it's just so much harder to spend time, and it's more emotionally draining to spend time and deal with this. But only when you do will you get rid of these demons. I mean, you can argue whether demons are real, but I think they can be generalized into this situation as something that is, say, more real than some of the things we worry about today. And so I'm just going to read this quote one more time. We give them the support, and it's not just doctors doing it. They need to share their destructive secrets, to shed their guilt, to purge their rage, and to unlock their potential. Now, it doesn't mean they're all going to become physicians, lawyers and whatnot, but they can become the best version of themselves. This is what everybody wants. This is what is on track. And I'm going to come to this later about the inimical, odd, basically underreported opium reversal under the Trump era. So here's, we're kind of rounding the hour or more. And this is Professor Bruce Alexander. He's retired, but this is his adaptive model. And some of the elements I've mentioned here: faulty upbringing. Tough phrase. Maybe all of us had faulty upbringing, but it's a matter of scale. Environmental inadequacy. He's not talking about the climate. He's talking about your household. with the things you do, your social milieu, genetic unfitness, I don't know, integration failure, economic dependence, family breakdown, self-hate, depression, aggressiveness, selfishness. These are not, I mean, these are bad things. They're not diseases. And what happens is we wind up with a problem. We wind up with a substitute adaptation, addiction to illicit drugs or illicit drugs. You know, methadone is technically illicit, gambling, food, sex, you know, criminality, fanatic, whatever. You get the idea. So this is Blaise Pascal, who was a great mathematician and also a theologian. I'm not going to read the whole quote, but basically, what else? He's talking about God, but what else does this craving and this helplessness proclaim? That there was once in man a true happiness, of which all that now remains is the empty print and trace. And then, basically, in vain, he tries to fill with everything around him in materialism, and it's not that. There's something else that people need to find and fill themselves with. And AA is basically a religion by other name, and NA is basically a mimicry of that, where they have to find that power. And people, for better or for worse, whatever your divine aspirations or ideas are, they have, I forget who called it, a God-sized hole in their heart. And how they fill it, they can fill it with one thing or another. It might have been Chesterton, so I'm not sure. Anyway, this is Bruce Alexander's empirical and theoretical adaptive model. This is, what year is this? 1990. This got a little spring in its step, but not that much. If you compare, again, the Ngram book citations and whatnot, there's a little blip down here, the adaptive model, but it's nothing compared to what has been the disease model of addiction. This is kind of the you know, this is the bien pensant, the, you know, great thinking, the well thought people of our day, the good thinkers. This is their model, and you go outside of this and you will have issues, as I've mentioned. So this is just, you know, how many hits you get on Google. Basically, the disease model has won. So what is the adaptive model? How does it play out? People can stop and read this later. But basically, addiction arises in fragmented societies because people use it as a way of adapting to extreme social dislocation. And unless you deal with that, and you basically, if you don't have consequences for people, you have issues. And the late Michael Gerson, who wrote for Bush 1, said, you know, he has a phrase called the soft bigotry of low expectations. So if you somehow think that you're going to help people, like the cupcake example, you know, you love them, but it's basically a soft bigotry of low expectations. You don't expect that they can do what you can do. So we see this with changing, you know, having kind of different racial expectations for getting into college or to pass on certain tests. The NBA doesn't do this. You know, the NHL doesn't do this. You either can or can't skate. You either can or can't shoot and guard. And there's no dispensation by race for certain people. You know, white men can't jump, perhaps. I don't know. I mean, there might be some base in that. But there's no dispensation to get a certain amount of white guys who can't jump on the team. We have had kind of this, so there's really, you know, no bigotry in a sense on those sports. And, you know, people will argue that point, but as far as getting on a team, it's basically a matter of skill. We have kind of the soft bigotry. And the methadone maintenance experiment came from this concept that those others in Harlem at the time, principally Black, would not be able to get off drugs such as people had been doing for the decades prior. Again, 30,000 heroin addicts extrapolated in the country in 1960, 1950, almost the same number, 1940, same number. It had been basically at zero. And because New York City, again, the bien pensant, the good thinking crowd, all in agreement, decided that those Blacks in Harlem, or those people in Harlem and Bedford Stuyvesant, could not possibly do the things that people had done the prior decades of abstinence and of expectation, go to work and whatnot, and have to deal with their drugs and issues and go through the kind of the perils of detoxing and whatnot through a reasonable length of time and or treatment and or positive reinforcement. They foist upon a different model, which plagues us to this date. So let's see, my closing is pretty much about that. Let's see if I have any other fabulous insights here, if any. Oh, yeah, I mentioned the Trump pause in opioid overdose deaths. That's over here. Almost never, I'm sure nobody here ever heard of this. almost got effectively zero coverage in the press. I give the New York Times one prop for having covered it. The COVID despair brought a huge increase in both opioid death rate and unemployment. Those go hand in hand. The unemployment rate dropping under Trump, this may not seem that much from the Obama era, but it was up to 10% under Obama. The people on the margins, this percentage over here, the people who go from being unemployed to employed under the Trump era, those are not your accountants and lawyers and whatnot. Those are the line workers, fast food, this kind of stuff. The people who have that job to go to, expectation may not be, writing the great American novel, but for them it's certainly novel, and it is great, and it's American to wind up. So what we're talking about here is dropping the unemployment rate and giving people hope, and getting people back to work in blue collar jobs. Changed the OxyContin profile, so they didn't go to those drugs. The adaptive model works. They adapted to having better circumstances, and they didn't need to adapt to bad circumstances by doing drugs. So this happened during Trump, and I don't think Trump had an anti-drug initiative per se. It certainly wasn't, forefront in his ethos. He wanted to get people back to working, wanted things made in America. This made a huge difference. And we see what happened conversely. We put people out of work, and boom. And this is, of course, if you look at QALY, quality adjusted life years, the death toll from heroin overdose and other, opiate overdose in general, if you add up the number of years lost per person, it's probably like 40 years of the average. I think the median age of heroin death is in the 30s, and the median age of life expectancy absent that would be probably in the, into their 70s. They may not live as long as others, but in their 70s or 80s, you're probably talking about 30, 40 years per person lost. And you take 40 times the number, the excess opioid deaths, which I think in the 30 to 40,000, and you have a pretty big number, numbering in a million life years. And I think that dwarfs, or at least exceeds, the COVID QALY, quality adjusted life year deaths, because those are mostly elderly, and half were probably nursing home level with maybe only a year to live otherwise. So this is one New York Times noting of this, but I don't think it was prominent. Certainly was not buoyed and passed around in the general press or news very much at all. Probably the first time most people have ever seen this. So in closing, here's my article. You can go find it on Brownstone. Here's my webpage. It's conveniently spelled the same as my name, randybock.com. I have a lot of interesting guests. If you have any suggestions for me, I'm happy to put them in. I'm mostly not on Facebook these days, mostly on Twitter. You can help support me by buying my book. It's Overturning Zika, the Pandemic. There was a fascinating story. We're not going to cover it today. And this is me on Twitter. That's pretty much it.